So good morning, everyone. I'm Trisha Stotler, and you are participating in the second Sunday Dharma series that is sponsored by the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C. And we've been doing these for about a year and a half now. It's been a really wonderful both opportunity to get to know Dharma teachers from all over the country and sometimes the world, and also to help raise some money for IMCW. So this is a fundraiser, and I just want to express my gratitude for those of you who have donated to be here this morning. If you've not had a chance to do that, there will be a follow-up email that comes with your recording for this session, and you will have another opportunity to do that. So just want to express my gratitude for that. So please check back to the website to find out who's coming up for the rest of the year for Second Sunday. We're looking forward to a great schedule. All right. So, yes, thank you, Miyako, for the ASL interpretation. And I believe that you can also click on the captioning button for captions. Trying to think of any other announcements. I don't think so. Right. So I am thrilled to have Matthew Hahn here with us this morning. Matthew is someone that I have gotten to know over the last year and a half, couple of years. We were in a pretty intensive program together, and I just so continued to be inspired. I have to say, mostly by his intellect and his practice and his dedication to the practice. And so I've been waiting for the right opportunity to have you on, Matthew, and have a conversation with me that others can hear and also be inspired by you. So yeah, Matthew is joining us from, are you in San Jose this morning? San Jose?
I'm in San Jose, California.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. So we really want to get into kind of like the whole enchilada today and what kind of brings you here. And I think it would be helpful to start with if you can just tell us a little bit about your story, or sort of like from the early years, like what kind of causes and conditions formed Matthew Hahn? It's a simple question. It's an easy one.
Super easy.
Yeah, super 10 minutes easy. Or less. Go. Yeah.
I think I can do that. Thank you for asking me to be here. And good morning to everybody out there. And well, it sounds like it's not just the East Coast, but everywhere. If I do this in the long form, it's a true crime podcast. If I do it in the short form, it's probably more like a rap sheet. So I'm going to try to find a comfortable medium. Let's just say that I've always been somebody who questioned authority a little bit, probably to the extent that it's unhealthy. And so when I was told not to do things, I often didn't believe, parents or authority figures, and whether, I kind of wanted to test the waters myself. Call me a scientist, whatever. And I grew up in the Nancy Reagan, as many people in this room probably did as well. I grew up in the Nancy Reagan, dare, just say no, that sort of era. And so I was always suspicious of people telling me not to do drugs. And it's funny because today we have states where pot is legalized and whatnot. It wasn't in the early 90s, as we know. And so I experimented with that as a fairly young person. I think the first time I smoked pot I was 12. And as it's going to be like a pattern as I tell my story, I crash and burn very, very fast. So I think I was arrested less than a year later. At a school dance at the age of 13. And you'd think that would have learned me something, right? You'd think like, oh, well, maybe they were right about this having negative consequences, but I wasn't quite that way. I needed to push the envelope a little further. And I don't think I'm unique in this particular regard. I mean, I spent high school partying a little bit. and it just escalated throughout my high school years. So it went from pot and drinking to harder drugs like cocaine, and eventually, sometime in the beginning of my senior year, I started using crystal meth. This would have been in 1997 or so. And that one hit me really hard. And I dropped out of high school, probably within 3 months. Probably within 3 months of starting doing crystal meth. Now, I'd already been on kind of a downward spiral. My family situation wasn't good. My parents were in the midst of separating and then having a divorce. I was angry about it. I was hurt by it. My partying had escalated. I'd gone from a very good student to a very poor student. And so by the time I dropped out of high school, it was a case of like just really not caring much anymore. And I spent the year and a half after dropping out of high school, kind of unemployable, getting kind of periodically kicked out of my house by my mother, living in a car, living in the garage. And eventually I started stealing to support my habit, my drug addiction. And that eventually led to stealing as an addiction in its own right. And so I harmed a lot of people. Long story short, I was eventually arrested at the age of 18 in 1999 for a number of theft-related charges, burglary, possession of stolen property, and whatnot. And I was subject to California's 3 strikes rule. So even though I wasn't convicted of any violent felonies, you still get strikes in California for serious felonies like a burglary. And so I ended up going to prison with a number of strikes on my record, which essentially meant that when I got home, if I ever committed a felony again, I would be subject to 25 years to life in prison. I spent just under a couple of years in prison. I came home and I was doing, pretty well. Going to college, I had a 4.0. I was not using drugs, though I was drinking. I had a pretty good job. I was married. It's a former wife, but I was married. Like things were going fairly well until a very, very close friend of mine committed suicide in a pretty violent way. And I was not able to cope. This was my first time being touched by death. This was my first time. I mean, I'd had family die, like a great grandmother and whatnot, but I'd never had someone this close to me die, and I did not know what to do with it. I remember telling friends and family at the time that I felt like the earth was caving in on me. And I relapsed within a couple of months on methamphetamine, and I just went back to what I knew. And so I went back to doing the same thing I had done, I guess 5 or 6 years earlier, stealing to support the habit and eventually becoming addicted to the stealing itself. And again, I hurt a lot of people. And as an adult, not being a teenager, I hurt people probably in exponentially greater ways than I had the first time around. More prolific is what I mean. In early 2005, I did a burglary. And in that burglary, and a little bit of a trigger warning here, but in that burglary, I discovered photos of the owner of what I'd stolen. I'd stolen a safe, owner of the safe, committing acts of sexual violence against a child. And I was at a bit of a moral crossroad because obviously with my 3 strikes, I couldn't walk into the police department and say, I'm Matthew Hahn. I've been burglarizing people in the neighborhood, but I found this. That didn't seem like an option on the table, so I decided to send them in anonymously. And watched the newspapers, and I saw that the person whose photos I discovered was arrested, and then I was arrested a couple of months later, unrelated to having turned those photos in, but eventually arrested for my burglary charges itself, and was facing not just 25 years to life, but 400 years to life. And that was in the spring of 2005. When I was arrested, I had an off-the-record conversation with the police officers in which I told them that I was the one who had turned in the photos. And as I was facing my life sentence, this other man was facing his own life sentence. And I was asked by the district attorney prosecuting him to testify to the fact that I had stolen the safe. The reason being that his evidence would have potentially gotten thrown out because of the method in which the photos were acquired. Against my lawyer's wishes, I agreed. And eventually that decision, essentially eliminating my ability to mount a defense in trial, led the district attorney that was prosecuting him to take it to the media. And this applied enough pressure to come off of a life sentence for me. So I took a 14-year prison sentence, a 14-year plea deal. I spent 7 years in prison, and we're going to talk about some of that coming up, but I spent 7 years in prison and paroled just a little bit over 10 years ago now. And a lot has happened since then. But I think the crux of that particular, that last half of the story, I suppose, is that strangely, if I had not commit a burglary that night, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. And it's a conundrum I still cope with and deal with and kind of try to wrap my brain around today.
Yeah.
There's the nutshell version.
Yeah, that's quite a nutshell. And I think, it does illuminate kind of who knows what we would all have done. Everyone can kind of put themselves in that position that you were in where, you had the choice to kind of do the thing that was going to seal this guy's fate. And maybe put yourself in harm's way for a life that you already knew what that was like, right? It just kind of brings that a little bit of the weightiness to, just really not being able to imagine the position that you were in. And Matthew's done all kinds of podcasts where he gets more into the details of that story, and you can find them. And what I really want to talk to you about today is, we all come to the Dharma through different routes. Many of us come because we're suffering. And so for you, what was the moment? I mean, was there a moment, or how did you get exposed to the Dharma? And then I suppose it wasn't like one, light bulb, but it's like a slow trickle over time. Or what were some of the thoughts you were having that made you think the Dharma was going to be a refuge for you?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of moments. There's the first time I was exposed to the Dharma, first time I heard it. And then there's when I decided that it was time to practice. Mm-hmm. And those two moments are separated by a number of years.
Talk about the first one.
Yeah, the first one was in community college. I'd been to prison already, and I was going to community college after coming home. I may have still been on parole, and I took a 3-quarter course in Eastern philosophy that kind of just took me through all these Eastern religions. And we got to the part on Buddhism. And I just remember hearing the Four Noble Truths and some explanation of impermanence and non-self and dukkha, and just recognizing it. Like it felt just so familiar to me. And there's so many different ways to interpret that, right? Like in hindsight, it could be, in a past life, I'd been exposed to the Dharma. Or it could be thought of as something as simple as it's so true that it resonates with anybody who hears it, like in a deep and resonating way. So whatever the case was, I heard the Dharma in an academic setting in probably about 2002. And I remember going, this is really the way things are, but I don't think I'm suffering enough to have to practice yet, right? I was 22 years old, and I just wanted to do what I wanted to do, and I wanted to have a good time doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But, the seed is planted, and we use that language sometimes. I'm also in recovery, and recovery is an integral part of my story as well. And we talk about this idea of like planting seeds. There's people who enter recovery and maybe don't stay there, but they remember what they heard there and then come back to it years later when the time has ripened. And in Buddhist language, we could just say the seed was planted, the karmic seed was planted somewhere, and the causes and conditions weren't ripe until I was in the county jail, facing the rest of my life in prison. I was not getting high anymore, and I didn't have that coping mechanism. My best friend was dead. My then wife was leaving me. I wanted to die. And I did, one thing I did then was decide to work a program of recovery, mostly out of desperation, because I said to myself, it can't get worse than it is now. And therefore, there is absolutely no harm in trying. And part of that was also picking up the Dharma, picking up a meditation practice and starting to study. Now, it was around this time, I've been in the county jail a couple of months, and I remember, I was hurting a lot. The desperation and the pain that I was in was nothing like I'd ever felt in my life. And I remember wondering if I was going to be here the rest of my life, wondering if how long it would be. And I just said to myself, and it's kind of like a prayer or an affirmation of some sort. I'm not a God-fearing sort of man, so it wasn't really directed towards an external source. But I was saying to myself, this hurts so bad. This pain is so vast and so great. Please just make it hurt enough and make this whole ordeal last long enough that I don't have to do it again, whatever that is. And I think built into that almost request for suffering was like a hint of the understanding that it's through that suffering, it is through pain that we can find wisdom. It is through welcoming it and looking deeply into it that it can be transformed. Now, I didn't know that at the time. It's just what came up for me. So I started studying the Dharma. I started studying in books and whatnot in the county jail. My first couple of years of practice were pretty rough. I didn't have a teacher. I was reading bibliographies, so I'd read a book that I liked and I'd like something that was mentioned. I'd go to the bibliography and mark it. And I'm so fortunate to have I had parents, very supportive parents, but my mother, especially when it comes to my book reading, I could send her lists and she would always order them for me. And so, just kind of like bouncing around different lineages, different traditions, and not really getting a footing in what I might think of as a stable meditation practice. In fact, I sometimes describe my first couple of years of meditation practice as not meditation at all, if any at all. It was more escapism. The world was so painful that meditation became a way of kind of like just getting lost and not being in jail or prison at the time. And I'm not particularly critical of myself for practicing in that way for a couple of years, because I think it was certainly a less harmful way of escape than what I'd been engaging with in years prior. So it was just something that I had to do. And in the meantime, I studied. The first sangha I sat in, the first time I sat with other Buddhists, was when I landed at Folsom State Prison. And I don't know how many people know about the Johnny Cash album, recorded in Folsom State Prison. It was recorded in the Chow Hall, but on the album, there's a song about Greystone Chapel, written by a man named Glenn Shirley, who was a prisoner at Folsom State Prison at the time. Anyways, that chapel, Greystone Chapel, is where I first sat in a sangha with other men and volunteers who brought the Dharma into prison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your first couple of years just reading and trying to figure out how to sit, and no sangha. I mean, I think we all know the benefit of being able to be with other people and using that sangha kind of as a support. So absolutely. I mean, so many of us do that same book thing, right? How long do we read before we think, oh, I could sit there? So meditation might be for me. Yeah, no. And kudos to Mom for sending you books that kind of fuel your passion for what you were learning. What you were reading was really resonating. So yeah, and born of suffering, that's how we do it. You told me a story about your lawyer one time. Where does he fit into this? This was your lawyer when you were in the county jail, or?
Yeah. I don't know how familiar folks are with the criminal justice system, but we've probably seen enough television to know that what you say to your lawyer is confidential, right? There's the attorney-client privilege, but what you say to your family is not. And so, like, the first time I was arrested, I was a kid. Yes, I was an adult. I was 18 years old, but I was a kid. We know that. And my lawyer at the time, his name was Steve. He now this is my first prison term, by the way, my first case. He kind of was nurturing to me, and he listened to me, and he was almost like a father figure to me. And I think that relationship developed because I was able to be honest with him, and I wasn't allowed to be honest to anybody else for fear that they could get called on the stand if I had to go to trial. And you don't want to put your parents in the position of testifying against their own son, And so I just became really, really close with him, and I hired him again for my second case. And I remember the first thing he said, he's like, I just don't understand the self-destructive nature that you've got going on here. I don't understand why you were so hell-bent on ruining your life. That's the type of relationship we had with each other. And so I hired him again to be my lawyer in my second case. And he had a heart attack and survived a heart attack. And he came to visit me a week or two later and told me about the heart attack, because I hadn't heard about it until he came to visit me. And he told me, he's like, I don't know why I survived, because it was a pretty big, pretty serious cardiac event. I don't know why I survived. I don't know why I'm here. Maybe it's to save you. Like, maybe it's to keep you from getting a life sentence. But then he went on to talk to me in that fatherly way, and he said, I'm not going to be able to prevent you from doing a long time in prison. Like, this is different than your last prison term. This, you will be lucky if you do a decade in prison. It could be longer. And I'm going to do everything in my power to prevent you from doing the rest of your life behind bars. But this is your home now. This is your home now. This is where you need to think about building the person you are. This is your life. You don't get to, just spend a prison term fantasizing about the past or reminiscing about the past or fantasizing about the future. This is where you have to figure out who you want to become. And who you are at the end of this long haul, this long prison pipeline that begins today, and it's dependent upon the decisions you make throughout. And we all, I don't know if these words would have resonated with me the same way if he hadn't died of a second heart attack a few days later. If we all remember the words of the last words of people that were dear to us. And so the last words he told me, the last words he shared with me were that this is your home. The first time I was in prison, I sometimes think of myself as having not been in prison. I was physically there, but as I alluded to, I was only gone for 20 months or so. I know that sounds crazy to some people to say only 20 months of prison, but relative to my second term, I was only gone like 20 months, and I spent the first half of it, in essence, reminiscing, thinking about past freedom, and I spent the second half leaning forward into future freedom. I never was forced to make a life for myself. in prison. I was never forced to go like, who do I want to be? What do I want to do? Can I learn? Can I become a scholar? Can I learn to weld? Can I get a college degree? Like those sort of things never crossed my mind. It was like, how can I get this sentence over with? What is the best way to kill 20 months? Like that's essentially how I spent my first prison term. But what happened with this advice from Steve and then the fact that I was going to be doing a long time is like, I looked forward and realized that I can't kill a decade of my life. I can't kill 2 decades of my life, whatever it ends up being. This is still my life, no matter how unpleasant the circumstances, no matter how much I wish it was different than what it is. It's still getting subtracted from my grand total days of being alive. And so I need to make the most of this moment. And it would eventually grow into kind of just a recognition that the present moment has everything I need, even if it's in the cell, even if it's in a penitentiary, even if it's in the middle of a riot or a lockdown or just awful things happening around me, which is what happened in there. The present moment holds everything I need. And I suppose in a way, then the present moment is home. It reminds me of there's the teacher Ethan Nichtern. Sometimes I think he wrote a book about this, but he talks about like the road home. And that was a pretty powerful conversation I had with my lawyer there.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, really moving. How often we don't want to close off the exit. We want the off ramps in the mind and not really willing to be sitting in the moment. So I think that story, while, extreme in your situation, probably has resonance for all of the ways we try to, get out of the moment. So thank you for that. And so, I was really interested to learn about how the Dharma gets shared in prison. And so IMCW sponsored a group called Insight on the Inside. They're now their own 501c3, and some of our community members volunteer in that program and have been part of that program. And so I was interested to learn from you what some of the pitfalls can be of learning, having volunteers come into prison and teaching the Dharma, having a sitting group, being able to like share a talk or facilitate discussion and whatnot, and then they leave, and that you're not allowed to have any kind of relationship with the volunteers that come into the prison. So the folks that are part of those sanghas, they're just kind of left hanging. I mean, how would you describe that in your own words? What was it like when you were in Greystone Chapel and part of that sangha? Like, how did it fuel you? And then also, what was the difficulty around not having like a true sangha?
Well, I wouldn't say I didn't have a true sangha. I wouldn't go that far. Like the sangha was beautiful and supportive and loving, and it I learned so much there, and I'm eternally grateful for volunteers that did come in. So let me mention that like some of this has to do with prison security regulations. It's kind of like what the issue, the stumbling blocks aren't with the people that come in. It's definitely not the people sharing the Dharma. The stumbling blocks have to do with the safety and security. I'll put that in scare quotes there. The safety and security of the institution. So a sitting group in prison is really no different than a sitting group out here. We came into the chapel, we took our shoes off, we got down on our cushions in a circle with the volunteer at the front of the room. We sat in silence for 20 or 30 minutes. Then there was a Dharma talk, and then there was questions and a little bit of kind of like community stuff, like the coffee or whatever you'd call it after the sit. And so that was awesome. And I don't know if I'd be as much of a man of the Dharma today if it wasn't for that sangha. So that's absolutely, it's essential to have those groups, and those volunteers are so valuable to the people who come inside. But the safety, security regulations for the prison and what it takes to become a volunteer to go in prisons, essentially tries to create like a firewall in terms of personal relationships between the volunteers and the people that are incarcerated. And so what that means is if I couldn't say, for example, have a visit with any of the volunteers. They couldn't come visit me personally. They wouldn't be allowed to write letters back and forth to me. They wouldn't be allowed to accept phone calls, right? And so a limitation of the volunteer only, I suppose, scenario is that people who are in prison who really, really want to dig deep and say, take part in like what I think is a really, really valuable and important part of the path, which is the student-teacher relationship, that becomes very difficult, right? Because they can't have that relationship with the volunteers. It's no coincidence that when we read books like the Jarvis Masters book, right? Or the book about Jarvis Masters, the Buddhist on death row, or you hear stories from like Fleet Mall, another person who was in prison who found the Dharma there. Like their stories are similar in that there were people from the outside who took an individual personalized interest in that person and then mentored them in their path to the Dharma without being volunteers. And so I suppose part of my personal project right now is, on one hand, I am preparing to start going to San Quentin State Prison as a volunteer to teach mindfulness and meditation. But I'm also trying to figure out ways to establish non-volunteer mentorship relationships between students and teachers so that we can develop people into perhaps teachers themselves behind the walls. One thing we have to recognize is that there are people in prison who are never coming home. And a lot of those people who are never coming home are the people that served as my mentors when I was inside, because lifers, they have a way about them. They've spent a decade, 2 decades in prison. They decided like maybe the way that they were living wasn't the way to live. And they've engaged in various forms of spiritual practice or self-help groups or anger management groups or whatever things are available to them. And they've been doing it for decades, and they end up becoming what I might term spiritual giants. But they may never come home. And this means that they may never have the opportunity to establish a teacher-student relationship with a Dharma teacher. And I'm negotiating ways to make that happen, I suppose. That's something that's kind of like on my radar, trying to find ways to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So just to clarify, that the volunteers who are officially trained and go in, they're leading the classes, but then the students, in order for them to have ongoing relationships or to be able to ask questions, they really need a mentor or a guide, a teacher who's not a volunteer. So to be able to kind of develop and cultivate like a core of volunteer meditators and teachers who are willing to correspond or visit and things like that.
That's right. That's right. Like in California, for example, I could have there's someone that I correspond with that's in one prison, and I'm getting ready to volunteer in a different prison. Now, if that person ever was transferred from the prison he's at into San Quentin, then I'd have a choice to make, right? Because I couldn't correspond with him and be a volunteer.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a matter of having close relationships with the people at the prison you're at. So yes, like I think there's also an element here that is a fantastic service opportunity available to people in sanghas throughout the country, right? Like the idea that perhaps people aren't willing to take the giant leap, or what feels like a giant leap, of committing to getting clearance to go in prison or go inside and start sanghas inside, but perhaps mentorship through mail or phone calls or eventually perhaps visits is something that is available to people and feels less committed. Mm-hmm. So I encourage people to consider those options in terms of folks incarcerated and delivering the Dharma in that way.
Yeah, really. Thank you. That's a wonderful potential opportunity, because I hear what you're saying when someone is in prison for life and all of those doors are closed. Can only imagine the amount of practice and reflection that gets to happen within that person. I can imagine that they would be potentially spiritual giants if that's the path they chose. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Mm-hmm. So what happened when you got out?
You want the outline? Or you want
yeah. How did your life, I mean, so you got out, I mean, to nutshell that is
nutshell. Yeah.
I mean, in a nutshell that for us?
Nutshell. Sure. I'll make it even more bullet pointed in the first part though. I paroled in 2012. I started at UC Berkeley that summer, graduated from UC Berkeley a short time thereafter because I'd had a lot of college that I did in prison. So I graduated in the end of 2013. During that period of time, I met an amazing woman who I think is in the group here somewhere, Noelle Clark, who you know as well because she was in training with us. So I got married. I've stayed sober. I had a very difficult time finding work after graduating from college, mostly because of my felonies and whatnot. So I decided to join a trade union. I did a 6-year or 5-year apprenticeship that took 6 years just because of the way things lined up, and graduated as a journeyman electrician, union electrician in California. I've traveled to Asia. I've studied in Burma. I done some training with you, recently ordained. I got lay ordination as Dharmacharya. Recently elected to union office, strange thing there. So that's like the nutshell, right? Bought a house, happy life, all that stuff, you know. But I think what you're pointing at is the Dharma stuff a little bit more. And, you know, like it really came up for me my last semester at Cal, at Berkeley. I took a class in which, you know, I had to get like 2 units. I had to get like a little 2-unit class, a little piddly one. And so I found a class that was designed to train people to volunteer in San Quentin. And I messaged the people providing the class and said, hey, I'm still on parole. I probably won't be allowed in. But would you be willing to let me take the class if I, you know, offer my experience for folks? They said, sure. And so like part of that, my agreement there then was at some point I was going to essentially teach a class, right? Talk about my story, share my insights into, you know, what works or what doesn't, and just stuff like that. So people could ask questions of someone who'd been the place they're going. Since coming home, I had difficult times in certain scenarios, speaking in front of people, being vulnerable, telling my story. But this was a whole nother level of what happened that day. Like I stood up and I actually spoke for like 15 or 20 minutes, you know, telling all of my background story. But then people started to have questions about prison politics. They started to have questions about like the racial structure and what the consequences were for violating certain prison rules. And I just felt like as I was standing in this room with whatever, 75 people in it, I had like I'm not going to call it a panic attack. I had a full flight, you know, fight or flight kind of like response. I felt like I genuinely feared that someone in the room was going to hurt me. And I had to sit down for a few minutes before getting back up and finishing. And, you know, a few months later, I think it was in 2014 or so, I started to go to a therapist, essentially because like I was having these sort of responses just when I would go to an AA meeting. If it was an AA meeting where I had to stand in front of the group, I again was terrified that someone was going to kill me. But then like I was a little bit better when I was sitting in a circle, right? It was like this weird relationship to how visible I was, though I wasn't really putting my finger on that yet. So I found a Dharma teacher who was also a therapist, and this was just wonderful for me. And we worked through a couple of things. And one of the things we worked through was, you know, I had a lot of melancholic stuff going on. Like I was feeling like depressed for no good reason, you know, and sad. And I was troubled by the fact that I had a lot of suicidal ideation. All of this stemmed back to that time when I was in the county jail and facing life in prison. Like I had habituated myself to thinking that if I got a life sentence, I would kill myself. And what ended up happening is like suicidal ideation essentially became a coping mechanism for when things became too difficult for me. Such that when I got out of prison, my life was great, but it had become so habituated that I essentially resorted to it even when I just didn't feel like going to work. Like it was like the way the mind works is these samskaras or sankaras, the way the patterns popped up, it wasn't adaptive. It was maladaptive, even if it was mildly adaptive at the time that I developed it. And another thing that came up, and this is related to like the visibility thing, is like she would have me sit down and tell her what was going on in my body. And then she'd have me stand up and tell her what was going on in my body. Sit down, stand up, sit down, stand up. And there was a differential between the descriptions of what I had going on physically, between sitting and standing up. And I think this is when she started to realize that it has something to do with visibility. But the long story short, and this relates to me discovering the safe, is that, as we know, people who are convicted of certain crimes and or people who, say, work with police are kind of bottom of the totem pole in prison, right? We'll call them informants or snitches. And I worried, even though I had done the right thing, I worried the entire time that I was in prison that somebody was going to either read the story about me and confuse me with the other person, or was going to think that I still wasn't justified in cooperating with the district attorney or the police in bringing him to justice. And so I worried that someone was going to kill me for that. And what this meant is that I spent the bulk of my prison term essentially trying to hide who I was, trying to hide, intimate details of my life, because prisoners can feel very anonymous. And there's buses coming to prison every day. And those buses could have somebody from the county I came from. And that person might remember my article. That person might remember that I was the guy. And I always worried that someone was going to figure out who I am. And so I did a lot of hiding. And so we worked through a lot of this. And then eventually my therapist said, "You know what, Matt? You know what I think? I think you want to be invisible. I think you just don't want anybody to see you." And hearing that was like a watershed event for me. It's one of these things. It's kind of like, when I described the first time I heard the Dharma, it felt familiar. It's like the first time I heard someone name my survival strategy, my strategy that was now maladaptive. It was the same familiarity. It's like, oh, she sees me. Oh, she sees me. And so my practice for a while revolved around paying attention to when these things arose. You could argue it was mostly like an elements and body scan practice, because when the physiological sensations of this fear would arise in me, sweaty palms, like tension in the forehead, like kind of tense chest, elevated, like a stressed breathing, these sort of things are what would happen. My mind would then go, uh-oh, it's happening again. You're getting anxious. And so the wheels would start turning. So part of the practice for me with this therapist was deconstructing the idea or the concept of anxiety or fear into its component physical sensations, right? Tenseness, heat, movement in the heart, tension in the forehead and whatnot. And then looking to see whether any of those individual sensations themselves, what their feeling tone was. Were they pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? And what was particularly, we'll say enlightening for me, but what was particularly enlightening for me was that all of these individual sensations unto themselves weren't particularly unpleasant, right? Like tension in the forehead is unpleasant only in context of me thinking it has to do with anxiety, but not necessarily unpleasant in the context as a physical sensation. And I found that was the case with most things. Like nobody cares whether their heart rate is elevated when they're, say, on the Peloton, right? Like it's fine then. But then when your heart rate is elevated, when you're getting ready to speak to a bunch of people, somehow it becomes a bad thing, right? So the context and the concepts that I was associating with physical sensations were where the principal feeling tone issues were coming from. And so the body scan and the elements practice are really how I found my way through. So I guess some degree of freedom from that maladaptive strategy I developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The mindfulness of the body.
It's always the gate.
I know.
You know, it's the gateway.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that Shannon has put that up in the chat as well. So Matthew is going to be taking your questions. So if you have one, you will look for the ask questions here in the chat and submit them there, and we will get to as many as we can. Yeah, I love talking to you because and we haven't even gotten into like the vastness of your Dharma chops at this point is one of my favorite things to discuss, right? And I think just so much of it comes out of obviously your experience, but yeah, just such a laser focused lens. You're going to be my new phone a friend, my Dharma phone a friend from now on, just because of the way you've been practicing and the sincerity and the grit of your practice. I just returned from a silent retreat, and Matthew, I have not told you this yet, but he sent me his schedule, right? It was like a self retreat. And I think your wake up time was like 3:30 a.m. And I'm here to tell you, I did not use your schedule.
I think my sleep time was like 11 too, right?
Yeah. So, your depth of practice is just kind of very inspiring, and you're learning to translate from Pali. Is that right? Are you?
Yeah, I'm currently in the middle of 3-part, basically a 10-month Pali course. I'm trying to learn how to translate suttas and read them, just so I can get some of this. I feel like you go to the original language and some of the context isn't lost quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all know how weird the word mindfulness is for that thing we're practicing, right? Like just even the idea of mindfulness being the way we translate sati is kind of strange. And I get why we do it, but mindful. Yeah.
And it's like bodyful is how it's mindful. Yeah, you're right. Good things are definitely coming from Matthew Hahn. We need to stay tuned for what comes next for you. Well, why don't I jump into our first question, which was a pre-submitted question. And it goes like this. Your story is very inspiring. For the transformation you went through, do you think it was chance or kismet, karma, that you are here answering this question instead of being 5 feet under? What brought you to this point? So this is kind of like that. So much of the long version of your story is like karma's just like binging all over the place. And how do you look at that aspect of things? Like how things lined up so that you're on screen with us here today? It's a big question.
Well, I have not yet acquired the divine eye, so I don't have a laser focus on all the causes and conditions that bring me here today. And just to address the word luck, I don't know what I feel about it as an ontological category, right? It's I feel like luck is what we call causes and conditions when they are basically imperceptible to us and they're working in our favor. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like everything is causes and conditions. And sometimes because we don't understand causes and conditions and they work in our favor, we call it luck. But like I mentioned earlier, for example, the safe discovery event, there was probably no other way that could have happened, right? In any other universe, And maybe I'll tell folks a little bit about that night, just so you get a sense of like, this is like kind of like a true crime podcast anyhow, but like the,
Go for it.
I entered a property at night and there were two houses and I walked on a driveway between the two houses in order to get to something behind one of the main houses. And as I was back there, now mind you, this is like 2 a.m. It's dark, lights are out everywhere. As I was back there, I heard what I thought was a noise or something made me feel a little uneasy. So I decided to leave. And as I'm walking away, the door to one of the houses is now open. And the light is shining out into the driveway. And it's when I looked through that door that I saw the safe that would eventually contain the photos of the abuse. And that's the safe I ran into the house and stole. I was a smoker at the time. If I had smoked a cigarette, it would never have happened, because I learned later that the person who lived in the main house was related to the people in the other house and had like run out of milk or something and had gone to the kitchen in the other house in the middle of the night in order to get a drink. And that's when I'd walked by. The grand jury testimony says that he saw us out the window and heard us, because I did this with another person, saw us take it. And so this event couldn't have happened in any other way. If I'd hit a stoplight, if I hadn't hit a stoplight, if I smoked a cigarette or hadn't, whatever, if I decided to put on a different jacket, the timing would never have lined up. And so that alone, just from the physical kind of universe element of it, tells me that causes and conditions are responsible for everything. I also know that if the person I was with, if that person had been the one who had opened the safe, they would have been discarded and not sent to the police, right? Because he wanted nothing to do with it, and that's why he still to this day remains anonymous. So there's an element of like, I had to be the person that day. I don't know why. I'm glad that I was able to end harm and allow myself to be free again. So I suppose that feels lucky, right? Now I know that I'm talking about life in prison versus freedom, but like in many ways, life in prison can feel like a death sentence. And it certainly felt that way to me when I was facing it. So I feel lucky. I feel fortunate. But I also know deep down, because I genuinely believe that this is the way the universe works, that it is causes and conditions in some capacity, that my upbringing made it possible for, despite the harm I was causing to people in terms of stealing, and despite the harm I was causing as a drug addict and the way I treated friends and family and whatnot, despite all that, there was some moral compass still present in there. To see what also needed to be done. And so I'm grateful for that. And that is causes and conditions. And if there's anything that I learned throughout my prison term, is it's such a gray, karma is such a gray, sticky mess. Like I can have events happen that are both, that are simultaneously like the result of what we could think of as good karmic fruit and bad karmic fruit. And prison was a perfect example. Like everything about my prison term lent itself to the transformation that I was trying to make. And it was terrible and painful and abusive and traumatic. And I, at the same time that I developed what I could think of as developed into the person I am today, I also developed, as we discussed, maladaptive, harmful strategies just to survive in that place. So, you know, it's a mixed bag, but I'm certainly grateful. You know, I had parents who were supportive, family that was supportive. The volunteers that came into the prisons, like I'm eternally grateful for them. You know, I had a sponsor that worked with me in recovery that I had never met before going to jail, and visited me and took my phone calls and followed me wherever I went in the state for all 7 years to support me and mentor me in my recovery process. And then just since then, the Dharma teachers that have given me their time and listened to me yammer on and on and on and on. And just the way that all of this has been given so freely to me. I definitely feel fortunate and lucky.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Andrea has a quick-ish question for you. She asks, what is the elements practice?
I would suggest turning to the Satipatthana Sutta, and the elements practice is in there, and it's there's different ways of approaching it, but the way that I would approach it, particularly in the Mahasi tradition, and the way I approached it when I was working with it in Burma, and the way I approach it today, is fire, wind, air, and fire, wind, air, and earth. Those are the four principal elements. There, of course, could be more if you wanted them to be, but those are the way I practice. And you can think of it as in two ways. One is you work with, I'm getting a message from Noel. Did I miss one? Fire, wind, fire, wind, water, and earth. Sorry. Fire, wind, water, and earth. So there's two ways of working with it, I think. Like in one way is to see one's own body as being constituted of those elements, as being constituted as the same elements as the world around us. And there's suttas that say when someone spits or dumps garbage on the earth, is the earth offended? There are ways of looking deeply into non-self, right? And then the other way one can work with elements, and this is the way I tend to practice, is that they can be thought of as qualitative, like a qualitative spectrum of the experience of having a body. So the water element, for example, it's not just water you're looking for, but it's the quality of water, which can be on one end of the spectrum, wetness, and on the other end of the spectrum, dryness. It can also be, if you think about like dry flour and you put water into the dry flour, it can also be this idea of cohesiveness, because when we add water to things, they tend to get sticky and stick together, right? Earth is the qualitative spectrum of hardness to softness. Fire is the qualitative spectrum of warmth and coolness. Anything in between is a quality of fire. And then air is the qualitative kind of like sense of space, but is often also thought of as movement, right? And so when we look at our breath, for example, and the abdomen expands, when the abdomen expands, it becomes hard. When the abdomen contracts, it tends to become soft, right? You can also think of that as the cohesion of the water element. And if you're practicing in a jungle where it's 100% humidity, you'll notice a lot of wetness and other things going on as your body like moves up against your wet shirt. So these are ways of like getting at the experiential element of the body. And I think if we're using words and concepts to describe what it's like to have a body, I feel like these are the closest we get. Any movement we have is hard, soft, warm, cold, moving, not moving. I think they're wonderful ways of working with the body.
Yeah. And so when you were practicing with the therapist and using the elements as a part of your practice, did you find that it sort of depersonalized your experience a little bit so that you could look at it? Do you know what I mean? Like the experience
Certainly.
of anxiety, then coming back to the elements.
I think when I was working with the therapist, the most important part was actually decontextualizing it from the concept that I was associating it with, right? So if you say, I'm feeling anxiety, what does anxiety actually feel like? Because anxiety is a word we give to a suite of symptoms, right? To a suite of sensations that, like, if they're in a particular constellation, right, we call that anxiety. Like, as I said, like the elevated heart rate isn't necessarily the only thing you come with anxiety, because you get that when you're exercising, right? So there's a particular constellation of arisings, I suppose, that creates what we would think of as anxiety. So for me, it was decoupling the bodily sensations from the concept, because once the concept started to happen, then I would go off the deep end, right? And so the idea was to get back just into the bodily sensations and then see whether they were individually pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So that's what was important for me. And I started to see that there wasn't congruence between the way I felt in my body and the concept I had about the way I felt in my body. They didn't line up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Leslie has a question. She says that we know there's prisoners who feel they're unjustly serving their sentence. How do you engage with prisoners that may even be lifers if they feel they're imprisoned erroneously? Like, so this is like a larger question about when you go back into San Quentin or do your prison work, you know, how do you look at that question for someone who may be coming in with, you know, I shouldn't be here, or I was unjustly.
I have, you know, one thing we don't do a lot of in prison is talk about why we're there, right? And part of the reason for that, it goes back to the same reason I didn't talk to my parents about my case. Lifers who are, say, trying to come home aren't going to talk about the details of their case with you, right? Because what if you're a witness one day in their appeal? I've run into people. I had a cellie once who said he didn't belong there, that he wasn't guilty. And I just didn't press him on it. Because ultimately for me, what's important is finding ways to help alleviate suffering, leading people to freedom. So I'm not going to distinguish between the person who thinks that they should be there and the person who, I'm not even going to say it, but, you know, is guilty of the crime they committed. Right? I was going to say deserves to be there, but that has too much implication. There's no need to distinguish between the two from my standpoint as someone sharing the Dharma. And honestly, I didn't distinguish between it in there. I didn't judge people if I thought they were lying about whether they were guilty or not. You know, there's people who'd been in there for 20 or 30 years. And for example, the man I told you who said he wasn't guilty of the crime that he was there for, I didn't care if he was or wasn't, because he'd only stolen $300 from a liquor store and he'd been there for 27 years already. Right? So like, he deserves to go home no matter what. Like, I don't judge him, you know? And if there's one thing I learned in there, it was not to judge people by the crime they committed. And I know it's easy to do that, but like, I learned very quickly that the most dangerous men behind the walls where I was were not men who were there for murder. They were there, people who were there for, you know, like career criminality in terms of like auto burglary or gang activity or assault and battery and things like that. Those were the types of people that were often the most dangerous in there, and they were usually under the age of 25. But when I was there, like, I found, and this was like a whole reordering of my preconceptions about what we think of as a murderer, right? That like most of the people that I sat in sangha with had been convicted of murder, you know, like, and they were wonderful, like genuinely sincere spiritual practitioners, you know, like, and I don't care what they were there for. I just want people to suffer less.
Yeah. Thank you. This is probably, well, we'll see. We'll see how we do with the answer, right? This may be one of our last questions. Kylie is asking, can you share a little bit more about how you worked with healing that hiding, don't want to be seen wound?
Mm. Well, some of it is just not hiding. You know, I spent my first year and a half when I was in college not letting anybody know where I came from, right? I was still hiding when I was there. And so there was a lot of coming out of my shell when I decided to do that class, right? It was terrifying. You know, sometimes I think of Dharma practice as like intentional self-exposure therapy, right? Like, we make a commitment to do all the stuff that's terrifying, you know? And I remember it must have been 2015, 2016. Okay, well, let me skip back a little bit. One thing I started doing is that I would just tell people what was happening to me. So I go back to a high school every year to speak to students at the high school I dropped out of, right? And the first couple of years, I would keep a chair behind me, right? In case I needed to sit down while I was speaking, because it was so terrifying. But after doing this therapy, what I started to realize is that people are actually okay with hearing me tell them what's happening to me. People don't judge me if I actually just say, hey, like, I'm a little terrified right now. Here's what's going on. And sometimes if it's a setting where I'm getting ready to talk about being in prison anyhow, you can just tell them why. And then that usually takes the power out of it. I was a little terrified coming here this morning just because it's an unfamiliar group, a lot of anonymous faces, and it's just there. So pointing at the body with my mind, directing attention at the different sensations, reminding myself that I've done things like this in the past and that it always turns out well. Those are like little parts of disempowering those maladaptive sankharas. And then I also have a fantastic support group, most principally Noelle, my wife. Like I remember, I was writing, but not showing anybody what I was writing. I was writing about my time in prison. And she's the one who said, Matt, just publish it on a website somewhere. I'm like, I don't know. Well, you should just put it there. It's good. Just put it there. And I did. And like that was an important moment for me. And she was the one who encouraged me to do the podcast, that the first podcast where I got to tell my story and make it like there's no sense hiding now because it's out there. She was the one who encouraged me to do that as well. And so having people that know you, that are also on this path, that recognize what's best for you to encourage you when things feel a little too scary, that was pretty important for me as well. And working with the visibility thing. It doesn't disappear completely, though. It's the samkara is still there. I just have a little bit more. I have a better relationship with it now. I guess I make tea with it, as they say. I make tea with it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Speaking of your website, this will probably go out in the post materials, but it was a Dirty Hands Clean Dharma. What is it?
Yeah. It's a trade term. Like we in unions I'm an electrician. We talk about dirty hands, clean money, and it refers to the idea of like working hard, working honestly, and earning from it. And I feel like so dirty hands, clean Dharma is kind of like a nod to like, I don't know, blue collar Dharma or something, but just this idea that you have to get your hands dirty. And what you put into the practice is what you get out of the practice. And that's where that name comes from.
Great. And we've just put it up in the chat too. There's a link to that. So, and as we kind of wrap up on time, it always goes faster than we want it to. Melissa's asking how she can support your mission to spread the Dharma into prisons. Are you connected to or forming a national movement to do this? That's a big question. What would you? Yeah, I know when I asked Matt in our previous conversation, so what are your future plans? He had a pretty good laugh about that, about just like kind of the uncertainty of what might come next. But yeah, I mean, there's obviously going to be a lot of energy generated from people listening to your story about the importance of being able to support the work that you're doing. Is there anything, and we can follow up, everyone who's here today and watching will get a follow-up email. We might be able to put some resources in there if you can't think on the spot, but what comes to mind?
Well, in terms of the individual mentorship stuff, that's something I'm developing and trying to work on, like a best practices thing that I'm probably going to have like a trial with a handful of Dharma teachers to figure out how to do it best. But I'm currently, in terms of volunteers, I am currently working with an organization called the Boundless Freedom Project, and you can look it up as that name if you so choose. And that has two wings. It's both religious ministry in the sense that it brings and carries sanghas in. It has a religious presence in California prisons right now. We hope to expand, but as well, it's also got a secular component that allows us to enter prisons through the programs department, right, rather than through the religious department. So trying to tackle the spreading of the Dharma in prison populations from two angles. Mm-hmm. So the Boundless Freedom Project, if you're interested, is the place I'm associated with right now.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Gosh, well, yeah. Thank you so much. We're kind of winding down, and I would love to offer you the opportunity to maybe lead us in a little closing sit, maybe dedicate some of this merit from this conversation to all those seeking freedom. Yeah, let me hand it over to Matt.
All right. Just want to say thank you. Thank you for having me. And let's just close with a little bit of silence and stillness. So if you feel comfortable, go ahead and close your eyes and just get in touch with what it's like to be here right now. What are the ways that we touch the earth? Do we touch the earth through the soles of our feet? Do we touch the earth underneath our seat? Do we touch it where our back rests against the chair? What are the touch points? These touch points beneath us is the result of gravity. It's the way the earth draws us to it. And then we have touch points on top of the body. What does it feel like to have clothing resting on the shoulders, pants on the legs, belts around the waist, shoes in the feet? Can we feel air on the skin? This is the way that the earth draws the objects above us to us. And to those objects, we are the earth. The sense of gravity around us, above us, beneath us. It's an embrace of sorts. A witness to our being. Shortly after the Buddha's awakening, Mara approached him and asked him, by what right and with what witness have you found liberation from suffering? Have you extricated yourself from the rounds of samsara? Wordlessly, the Buddha reached forward and touched the earth. This is our birthright. I'm going to close with a dedication of merit that I'm borrowing from my recovery Dharma community. Refuge does not arise in a particular place, but in the space within the goodness of our hearts. When this space is imbued with wisdom, respect, and love, we call it sangha. We hope that the suffering in life actually leads us back towards the heart, and that we might understand compassion, wisdom, and change ever more deeply. As we have learned from practice, great pain does not erase goodness, but in fact informs it. May we make the best use of our practice and whatever freedom arises from our efforts here today. May this be a cause and condition for less suffering and more safety in the world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. Such a pleasure. I hope you'll come back. Yeah. When that book is done.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah. And thank you for everyone who was able to join us today and those watching the recording. We really appreciate your presence and your practice, and check back for future Second Sunday Dharmas. We are really delighted to be with you every month. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Noelle, and everyone else on the call. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.